Welcome to another episode of The Loins of History. My name is Jay, and I'm joined by my co-host Colin. This is episode 14 in our series on U.S. and Chinese relations, where we've been trying to connect the history between our two countries to current events. And last episode, we talked about the first and second Taiwan Strait crises. In the 50s, that was really the first time the U.S. and China began to fight over Taiwan. We had just fought the Korean War, but now things are beginning to shift towards Taiwan and the Republic of China. So this week, we're going to be talking about the split between the CCP and the Soviet Union, the CCP being the Communist Chinese Party, and the Great Leap Forward. So, Colin, what are our key takeaways for this episode?
Jay, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really excited to talk about the Sino-Soviet split and the Great Leap Forward. So first, with our key takeaway, the Sino-Soviet split was due to a difference of philosophy on the future of communism and really who was going to be the heir to Stalin, whether it was going to be the Soviet Union or Mao's CCP. The Great Leap Forward was not just an event to improve the Chinese economy, but it was a strategy to overtake the former imperial powers that ruled over China, like the UK. Mao is even quoted as saying, in 15 years, we'll overtake the UK in industrial production, but it was also to overtake the Soviets as well. Number three, the Great Leap Forward exhausted the Chinese and led to Mao's Cultural Revolution. Number four, the U.S. was now truly in a multipolar power struggle. So it was no longer just the U.S. versus USSR. It was really the U.S. versus USSR versus China. And they were all three competing during this Cold War era. And then finally, during the Great Leap Forward, this really becomes the first time in about 110 years that China was in charge of its own fate. If you remember, it was back in around the 1840s that the British defeated the Qing dynasty in the First Opium War. And really, since then, the Chinese had been more or less at the mercy of outside powers, whether it was Western imperial powers like the UK, France, Germany, or even Japan, and relied on aid from the US through World War II. But now China is making its own fate. So this is the first time in a long time. So we've ended the century of humiliation, and you've probably heard this before, but they entered into their own 100-year marathon where they are now running their own race. So those are the key takeaways.
Great key takeaways, Colin. What can you tell us about the Sino-Soviet split?
So the Sino-Soviet split is honestly something that I think a lot of Americans are unaware of, that the Chinese and the Soviets almost got into their own Cold War. And it's really something that was kind of unexpected, too, because it seems like they would be natural allies. And they were allies in a sense for a while. But after, I think, really Khrushchev comes to power in 1956, you start to see that the fracture begins and it never really closes up. So in 1949, if you remember, Mao and the CCP won the Chinese Civil War. They declared themselves victorious. They took over the Chinese mainland. In that year, he met with Stalin, and they began discussing communism, the future of China. And in that meeting, it was productive. It led eventually to, a year later, the signing of the Sino-Soviet Alliance of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, SST FAMA, if you want to remember it. It's kind of an interesting, but we talked about it in the past two episodes, really mutual defense, economic aid. The Soviets ended up giving them about $300 million in aid for their economy to keep it from faltering during this transition period. And then they sent political and technical expertise so they could jumpstart the Chinese economy and military. But in that meeting, Mao kind of walked away personally feeling slighted in that he was not an equal to the Soviets. And it kind of invoked the feeling that we had talked about previously with this century of humiliation, that the Chinese were still somewhat underneath these foreign powers. And it didn't feel like a meeting of equals. It felt like a meeting of big brother, little brother. But Mao still looked up to Stalin. And I have to think this is kind of my own personal take, just looking through the history of it, that Mao sort of looked up to Stalin as a model because they were very similar in their personality. They had a cult of personality that surrounded them. They were both strong dictators. They would pretty violently suppress any dissent in what they did, but they both led their countries. They were both part of a revolution. They were both led their countries through World War II in their own respective manners. Obviously, technically, Chiang Kai-shek was in charge of the KMT in China at the time, but Mao was still, in his mind, in charge of China. So they had a lot in common, and I think Mao did still, in a way, look up to and respect Stalin. So even though he felt slighted, it was still an alliance. He still looked up to Stalin. They still had close ties, economically, militarily, politically. Fast forward to the Korean War, and even in the Korean War, the Soviets provided technical assistance, military supplies, air power, but they didn't actually get involved. And the Chinese, again, felt this was kind of, they felt like this was not being a very good ally for them, that it sort of violated the spirit of the mutual defense agreement that they had signed back in 1950. So you had all these little things, from a difference of opinion, feeling slighted in meetings, the Soviets not backing the Chinese when they were in conflict with the Taiwanese out of fear of the U.S. And Mao began to suspect that both Stalin and the Soviets kind of feared the United States and were not actually willing to go to fight with the United States. So then Stalin dies in 1953. We mentioned this last week during the Taiwan Strait Crisis episode, and there's sort of a power vacuum. And then Khrushchev takes power in the Soviet Union in 1956. And then he gives his famous secret speech. And the secret speech was several hours long, where he just talked. And one of the biggest takeaways from this, and the Americans eventually got a copy of this speech, and they kind of saw what they thought was a hopeful situation where they were going to be able to improve relations with Khrushchev, because Khrushchev railed on Stalin. He absolutely was very critical of the gulags, the work camps, the forced relocations, the purges, the rapid industrializations, his economic plans. I think at one point he basically, and I'm paraphrasing, called Stalin an idiot, and that he had no idea what he was doing during their own leap forward and their own economic plan in the 30s. He basically said that he never went to visit the poor farmers. When we had to get rid of the kulaks, the dekulakization of Ukraine and the Soviet Union, he basically had no idea what was actually going on. He put these massive quotas on. He set this system in place, but all he was doing was looking at photographs that were very obviously staged and looking at numbers that were obviously wrong, that were being presented to him inaccurately. And Stalin didn't care to take a closer look, and it led to the death, I think, they estimate 5 to 10 million people starved to death at this point, and it was totally unnecessary. Like, people, and we'll see this in the Great Leap Forward, but people were starving to death because all their food was being taken and then rotting somewhere else based on government quotas. And Khrushchev railed on him for that. And he did it over a period of hours where he didn't take a break. One of the so from the U.S. perspective, they were looking at Khrushchev as somebody who they could form better relations with. We could de-escalate the Cold War, potentially, this détente we've heard. But Mao and the Chinese CCP looked at it as an attack on them, because, like I said, Mao and Stalin are very similar. They ruled the same way. They had very similar views on communism, and the CCP did not like it at all. As a matter of fact, there's a quote that I want to read real quick from the People's Daily on April 5th, 1956. So this is right after the secret speech. And they said, "Some people consider that Stalin was wrong in everything. This is a grave misconception. Stalin was a great Marxist-Leninist, yet at the same time a Marxist-Leninist who committed several gross errors without realizing that they were errors. We should view Stalin from a historical standpoint, make a proper and all-round analysis to see where he was right, where he was wrong, and draw useful lessons therefrom. Both the things he did right and the things he did wrong were phenomena of the international communist movement and bore the imprint of the times. Taken as a whole, the international communist movement is only a little over 100 years old, and it is only 39 years since the Great October Revolution. Great achievements have been made, but there are still shortcomings and mistakes. Basically, they were saying like, yeah, he may have done some bad things, but overall, he's still a great man, and we look to him with reverence because
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, they were trying to defend Mao.
Yeah. So, yes. So, let's not forget the name, what Khrushchev titled this secret speech. It was called "On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences."
Yeah, and
so it wasn't just like an ideological, like, Mao wasn't looking at this and going like, Khrushchev was wrong about Stalin, and Stalin had similar ideological principles to me. It's probably also true that Mao was probably like, oh crap, like he's attacking the very idea of the cult of personality within communist governance, of which was very strong in China. Mao's picture is still hanging in Tiananmen Square today. Like, there's still a cult of personality on Mao.
Well, they quietly during the 8th Congress of the CCP, they very quietly removed Mao Zedong thought from the CCP constitution. Because of this event, they're like, oh, okay, we're going to quietly take this away.
Sorry, when was that?
In the 8th Congress. It was in 1956.
Oh, because it's at some point it must have got put back in there because it's still in there today. Because it was a big deal when they put Xi Jinping thought in there as well, next to Mao.
Well, I can tell you Mao wasn't very happy with it. It was Liu Shaoqui and Peng Dehuai, and they didn't like the contents of Mao Zedong thought, and they deleted it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they put it back in at some point.
It probably got put back in, but right after this in 1956, it got taken out.
So I guess the point here, specifically on the cult of personality aspect, is I think what Khrushchev was trying to get at was he saw firsthand. He dot the Great Purge prior to World War II. Like Khrushchev was very much literally dodging bullets during that time, as everyone who survived it. And he saw what Stalin was doing was less about good governance and more about consolidating and protecting his own power. Mao was doing the exact same thing as Stalin. Mao was creating this cult of personality within China, which is consistent with Chinese history. So it wasn't identical to like the Soviet style, oh, Stalin is great. It was very consistent with like honor the emperor type deal. Like, and we see Xi Jinping doing the exact same thing today. But nevertheless, it was like, you can't say anything bad. All of our good comes from, the leader. This definitely got translated. We see it in the North Koreans too, calling various members of the Kim regime the dear father and great leader, and putting their pictures up in Pyongyang, etc. So the cult of personality is very important to Chinese and Korean communism. And so to their own people, to prevent them from drawing the same conclusions about the cult of personality, they immediately had to condemn what Khrushchev was doing to protect their own power.
Yeah, and it kind of morphs into this part of the other conflict was, like I said in the first key takeaway, who's going to be Stalin's heir? It was almost kind of like this almost seems very religious in a sense. Like, who's going to be his heir? Who is the rightful heir to or some sort of royal conflict or religious conflict? And it's almost religious in a sense because part of the philosophical difference between the CCP and the Soviet Union was how they interpreted who was going to be the vanguard of the revolution. And if you have studied Leninism and Marxism, you know pretty well that they believed that the urban working class, so those who are in the factories, working in industry, they owned the means of production, and they were going to be the cultural vanguard of the revolution. They were going to be the ones who would seize the means of production. They would be the vanguard. Mao in China did not have Russia was not like this great industrial power in 1917, but they still had quite a bit more industry than China did during the 20s and 30s. China was primarily this rural peasantry that Mao took advantage of. So in Maoism, he believed that it was the peasant class that was going to be the cultural vanguard. They were going to be the revolutionaries, and that's who he keyed on as his primary source of power and who he leaned on. He also persecuted them horrendously during the Great Leap Forward, and we'll see in the Cultural Revolution when we get there. But he believed that they were going to be, it was more of a landowner versus land worker. And that's the conflict, the social conflict that he seized on. And he was like, this is what I'm going to lean on. This is where we're going. This is the source of the communist power within China. And he believed that that was the right way to move forward. He was also, like you said, he leaned on the cult of personality. He was in favor of purges, relocations, moving to the gulag and work camps, and heavy propaganda, whereas Khrushchev was a little more against that. Mao also didn't want to work with the United States. And he was very critical of Khrushchev in some of their meetings later for working with the United States. And even though Khrushchev, I think, is quoted when he visited the United States with Eisenhower in like 1958, and he's quoted as saying, your grandchildren will still be communists or something to that effect. He was still very open, and he even praised Eisenhower's foreign policy. And Mao looked at that as like a slap in the face. And I think in their meeting in 1959, it was highly contentious. And it was so contentious that it was a planned 7-day visit, but they ended up cutting it down to 3 because they were just unable to come to any sort of agreements. And it was little things like that, like the way Khrushchev would praise or perceive the United States. There's also a few more things that occurred. For example, the Taiwan Strait, we mentioned it last week, that the Russians, especially in like 1953, didn't really back aggressive action and offensive action by the Chinese. They didn't really do it in the second crisis either. Mao didn't like that fact either. He believed that Khrushchev was afraid of the United States. We see later in the 60s, there's a border dispute between the Indians and the Chinese, the CCP, that in 1962, and the Russian or the Soviets actually backed the Indians, and culminates in a point in like 1968 where we see that there's there's a small conflict, a couple hundred CCP troops and Russian or Soviet troops were killed over a border dispute where it very nearly became a nuclear war. So, we see this schism occur, the great schism between the two, and it just never really repairs itself. And China sort of takes its own path.
Sorry, can I take us back just
rewind.
Like a minute or two?
Hit that rewind button.
Because I think you touched on some really good points about these ideological differences in how Chinese communism smells different than Russian communism. And even just thinking about how when Americans talk about communism, like pro-Marxists here in the United States, how like it just, to me, in full disclosure, folks, my bias is very anti-communist.
Better dead than red.
To me, it's obvious that like Marx and Engels, they were speaking in a time of rapid social and economic change in Western Europe, right? Like Karl Marx was living and writing in Germany. Friedrich Engels was living and writing in Great Britain. And their view of the social change, the economic change that needed to occur is just tied to their context at the time. And it's also very ethereal. Like in so much of Marxism, actually, let's call it socialism. So much of socialism sounds good on paper, and we have an entire episode about this on a history of capitalism and socialism here in the United States. And there were several different examples of where these people with seemingly good intentions would try to actually implement the socialist policies, and like it never worked. As a matter of fact, it did way more harm than good, as I'm sure, Colin, when you get into the Great Leap Forward, the irreparable damage and the great and tragic loss that the Chinese suffered trying to actually implement these policies. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is pure Marxist-Leninism viewed the power base of social change as the peasant class, right? Uh, and it placed a hard distinction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? Like the people who were being oppressed and their oppressors, right? It placed a hard distinction between the two. Well, when you actually try to establish a society or establish a government with that hard bifurcation, it doesn't work. So usually people within the communist or socialist parties begin to see this, people like Khrushchev, people like some of the Soviet leadership, people like Deng Xiaoping after Mao died, they all look and they go, okay, we need to modify this somewhat. And therein lies, from the true orthodox communists, the distinction. So we talked in a couple episodes ago about Mao using the term revisionism. Well, the whole root of revisionism claims that, okay, maybe we need to soften up this bifurcation between the two classes. Maybe we actually need to work together. Maybe we can still, control the means of production, but we're going to soften up this class war a little bit, and we're actually going to make alliance with the middle and upper classes to try to rule our society. I think that's what Khrushchev was trying to do. He was trying to go, okay, maybe we don't need to, kill one another, and our society can function a little bit better. But Mao, to your point, Colin, there was no middle class. There was no industrial elite within China. So Mao, by definition, by necessity, had to criticize this view, because there was no China by the mid 1950s still had not industrialized. They were very much agricultural, just like in the Qing days. There was no industrial China. So I guess to sum up this long tangent here is that Engels was writing in industrial Great Britain. The things that he was saying is not going to apply to China. Like, China, almost 100 years later, still hadn't industrialized. Russia had barely industrialized by that point.
So, keyword barely.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess, sorry, to kind of maybe even make a little bit easier transition for you, is when it comes to U.S. and Chinese relations and kind of rolling the ball forward here, there's ideology and then there's reality, right? The U.S. hadn't implemented communism because we were very much an industrial. We were the world's leading economy. To the communists, we were the enemy. Right? The economic factors prevent socialism, communism, Marxism, Leninism, whatever we want to call it, from really taking root within here in the United States, because we have a much, much, much higher standard of living here. So it's really hard to try to talk about, to try to motivate the quote unquote lower class to stand up in a workers' revolution, because they're by and large content. Capitalism works. It does a good job. Like, our standard of living is much higher. So we were ignorant to the ideological differences. We just saw communism, when in reality, there are drastic differences between communism and how it's implemented in Russia versus China. Yugoslavia is another place that wasn't on board with Stalinist style communism. Go ahead, Colin.
Yugoslavia is kind of an amazing little story. The fact that Tito was able to hold it together. Anyway, maybe we'll get to that eventually someday in a future episode. You little Yugoslavia sidebar. Yeah. Okay, so that is the perfect segue moment, way to summarize it. Americans just saw communism. We did not see a fundamental difference between the Chinese and the Russians. And perfect example, we talked about this in the previous episode, like who lost China. If you go back and listen to that, I posted on social media, there's a great book called The China Mirage. He talks in a lot of detail about the Dixie mission, different generals and military advisors who had these opinions on China. And when you read through it, there was a massive fundamental understanding. Just to reiterate this, Pat Hurley was was quoted to say that the difference between the KMT and the CCP is like the difference between Democrats and Republicans in Oklahoma. I think that just kind of sums up the whole idea that he missed the underlying class struggle. And Mao was huge on class struggle, almost more than Stalin, really more than Stalin was. Like, he utilized class struggle. We'll get to it when we get to the Cultural Revolution. Like, that was a linchpin in how he sees power. They were kind of, he was the Secretary of State Service at the time. He looked at, they looked at this as like, oh, these good agrarians, they're these hardworking farmers, and they just want a little bit of, the term we throw around now is social justice. They're leading the revolution. They're good people. I don't think they realized the plight that they had been suffering and how Mao was going to utilize that to throw their country into chaos. So we assumed that they're going to operate the same exact way as Russians. Totally wrong. And I think the reason I brought that up is just to look back and be like, we were so wrong in the 40s. Like, we didn't even understand what was going on culturally there at the time. We just assumed that they would be just like the Russians. They were completely different. And that just highlights the fact that we had no idea what was going on, and they're very different. And to your point about looking at the Chinese, I think you mentioned this with the North Koreans and how they revere their leaders. It's almost kind of like Mao was sort of like a god emperor type of, he had like this mandate from heaven almost. And if you criticize Mao, you are criticizing his right to rule, and you are thus criticizing and being critical of the CCP. And it's almost kind of like he incorporated all of that, those thousands of years or hundreds of years of the mandate of heaven. He just kind of repackaged it into this CCP, him being the cult of personality. And he just sort of channeled that belief in the mandate of heaven and put it into the CCP. So when you're critical of that, you're critical of the mandate of heaven. And we've, in previous episodes, gone over how important that mandate of heaven actually is.
Yes. No, that's right. Another thought, talking about criticizing the middle class, like, because you said Mao was harder about class distinction than maybe even Stalin was. And that was easier for Mao to do because, just throwing out completely made up numbers to prove a point here. And that is like, if 10% of China's population is middle and upper class, Mao can talk all, kinds of crap about him. And he mobilizes the 80%, right? 80 to 90%, right? Whereas in Russia, let's just say it was 30%, right? Is the middle class. He's like, it's a little bit riskier, right? Well, here in the United States, what is it? It was like depending on, I was just looking this up, depending on whatever model you use, anywhere from 50 to 75% of all Americans are a part of the middle class. So it's like, if you start talking trash about the middle class, like, you're basically going to be ignored, which is exactly what has happened to official communism in the United States. Like, nobody wants it. Like, the only thing that gains any kind of traction are Americans who feel like they're in poverty, or who are actually, in fact, in poverty. But that class is hard to mobilize because they're usually not that politically active, at least not historically. So,
it's funny you brought up the number 30%, because that was a big number for Mao. During the Great Leap Forward, they would confiscate 30% of all grain harvest. And Mao was famous for saying that any number above 30%, or any number that is not above 30%, he's like, we can take, they won't revolt. Jay, there's one last point I want to make about the cult of personality that surrounds a lot of these totalitarian dictators. I think it's hard for us in the West to imagine, looking at it now, we see millions of people dying, mass suffering. We see people starving to death. And a lot of times we think, how could this happen? And people not say, no, enough is enough. We're going to revolt. I mean, the American Revolution occurred because of a 3% increase in tax. We fought off the British. But in China and Russia, as well as the Soviet Union, millions of people starved to death and they didn't revolt. And obviously, fear and intimidation is probably two of the biggest ones. But I would argue that the cult of personality was kind of this third leg to the stool that allowed them to remain in power. in the Soviet Union, you had the NKVD, the secret police. The Chinese had the same sort of the same apparatus in place to really root out dissent and investigate you. I mean, they turned families against one another, friends against one another. So everyone was really afraid, and they also controlled media and information extremely tightly. But at the same time, in the Soviet Union in the 30s, you had the dekulakization, and you had people dying in Ukraine. I think 5 to 10 million people starved to death. But a lot of people living in the Soviet Empire looked to Joseph Stalin as this man who he was leading Russia to be this great power. He was taking us into the industrial age. A lot of people couldn't read. He was giving us an education. He was giving us a job. He was one of us. He was, he was a former member of the proletariat. So they looked to him as this inspirational leader, and they were willing to sacrifice or endure some hardship. Most were. There was still some dissent. And I think the same thing existed in China with Mao. Mao was the leader that he led the CCP through the Long March. He resisted the Japanese. He fought the evil imperialists in the KMT who were backed by these evil powers. So he was revered almost in this semi-godlike kind of nature. The Chinese have a history of the mandate of heaven. I mentioned it earlier this episode, where their leader, if you had the mandate of heaven, you were the legitimate ruler. That kind of just changed forms into Mao. They didn't talk about the mandate of heaven anymore. It was probably could get you in a lot of trouble with the CCP, but they still looked to Mao as this leader who had the mandate. He had done all these things. He is changing China. We are no longer going to be humiliated. It got to the point that even during this great leap forward, we'll see people were starving to death while grain rotted in grain silos. And fake quotas were being reported, but people would do that, and they would risk starving themselves and their family to death just for the reward of a photograph with Mao. Just a chance meeting where Mao says, "Good job, faithful citizen," takes a picture and moves on, and doesn't care if you live or die another day. People would do that just for that moment, and I think that almost transcends fear and pain, because it gives you some sort of hope and inspiration and that's what's dangerous about this cult of personality and totalitarian rulers, is it gives them this kind of semi-legitimacy and authority to act in all these crazy ways and kill people, and allows them to use this fear and intimidation. So it's just my thought on it. And I want listeners, especially Western listeners, to hear that and think maybe this is part of the reason that these totalitarian governments are able to exist with seemingly little resistance from the average person in those countries.
Yeah, I think it's interesting listening to you talk about the cult of personality. Like there's something in human nature that wants to believe in a leader that can solve all of our problems, that will make everything better, and will make us happy because they're in charge. What's funny is these autocratic systems depend on a view of human nature that humans are basically good. And we talked about this in a previous episode on the political ideology of the U.S. Constitution. The American founders believed that human beings were not basically good. And you can see it in the Enlightenment view of a separation of powers, that if power is concentrated not just in one person, but in one branch of the government, too much, like if there's too much power concentrated in one branch of the government, that branch of the government will try to take over the other sides. You could take it to its extreme that if power is concentrated in one person, cough, cough, Mao Zedong, that person will try to take over how everything is run. And that's not a good way to do governance. So as we see here in the Great Leap Forward, like so much stuff was dependent upon Mao Zedong and his whims. Like, and when I say whims, I'm not using that term flippantly. Like this guy, somebody would give him a good idea and he would just run with it. And that good idea was not a good idea. And it would like get people killed. Whereas if there's a balance of power, it assumes that people are fallible. It assumes that you can have the maximum benefit while maximum benefit by distributing that power widely, so that we can check one another's bad ideas. When Mao Zedong had a bad idea, there was no one there to check his bad idea, and people died.
Yeah, he had a lot of, you're right, his whims. We'll get into it in probably the next episode or two with the Cultural Revolution. He would literally have an idea and it would end up getting millions killed, including within his own party. I think the quote from the book The Cultural War was that he was never in control of the Cultural Revolution, but he was in charge. So he would just unleash chaos because he had an idea like, hey, this might be a good idea to root out some dissent. And then he would just let it roll.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that...
And his preeminent concern was to stay in power. So what you do when your preeminent concern is to stay in power, you begin either eliminating or killing the people who are threats to your power. So that includes people within your own party.
That's a good point. And that's kind of a good segue into the Great Leap Forward, because he does this numerous times, because the Great Leap Forward, as we'll see, was very bad. It was a net negative, I would argue, on the country in a lot of ways. And that's a very neutered way of putting it, that it was a net negative. So the Great Leap Forward... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so Colin, can you tell us a little bit about the Great Leap Forward?
Thanks for the setup, Jay. No, it's okay. So going back to 1949, if you remember, the KMT is defeated. They retreat to Formosa, set up the Republic of China there. PRC is founded in 1949. So the Civil War ends, and one of the questions that immediately needs to happen or be answered is, what do we do with the economy? There was some internal debate about some moderate transition to industrialization, but obviously Mao Zedong, as we just discussed, he wanted a certain way, and that was a radical change. He wanted it rapid, and so he had met with Joseph Stalin that we mentioned before, and he wanted to establish a plan around similar to Joseph Stalin's 2 5-year plans. And if you remember, those led to millions of deaths, but it industrialized the country. So Mao looked at that as a success, because Russia, similar to China at the point, was considered very backward compared to its neighbors. You know, China was competing with Japan and its former colonies or colonizers with the UK and the US. Russia obviously looked to the rest of Europe and was behind at the time. So he wanted to do something similar. So the first 5 years, it was more of a collective shift. So they would form, like we mentioned, it's peasants, it's rural. So what they would do is they formed these collectives. So they redistributed wealthy landowners' land, private farms. There were still some pockets of private ownership of land, but it was still formed in these collectives. And within these collectives of a village, it would probably be 100, maybe 200 families, but they were still relatively small compared to what we'll see. And the government would control, they centralized the agricultural economy. So they would control the prices. And that was what Mao believed could fund growth in industrialization. It kind of worked, but they weren't generating the same amount of money that they needed to fund this industrialization, and it was moving fairly slowly. Fast forward to the secret speech in 1956, where we've already talked about that, where Mao took that as a personal slight. He recognized that there was obviously dissent in the USSR that had been festering under Stalin. And he launched what was called the 100 Flowers Campaign in 1956. And this campaign was, as he believed, that we need people to really buy in to communism and to the PRC. How are we going to do that? He's like, well, I believe the intellectuals are the ones who are not fully backing communism right now. I need a way to bring them out to rally behind communism. And officially, it is the official report on it is that he believed that the intellectuals would come out. They would provide, quote, constructive criticism to communism. They could help provide some inspiration to the peasants, some good ideas, and allow them to come out if they felt heard and they felt their voices were being recognized and some of their ideas were being actually implemented, that they would get behind communism and he could, bring them alongside. The reality of the 100 Flowers campaign is that I personally believe that he used this as simply as a way to root out any dissent. And he knew that there was going to be some dissent in the intellectuals. and he wanted to get rid of it. He wanted to find out who his enemies were. And that's pretty much exactly what happened, because as soon as the 100 Flowers campaign ended, there was an anti-rightist movement where they accused all of these intellectuals who were critical of the party of being rightists, of being, I think they call them capitalist roaders, because they wanted to take the capitalist road. They were these subversives. They needed to get rid of them. Actually, all of their criticism was not heard, and it was bad. So they did just that. They started persecuting these people that came out, and that was kind of the first real purge, if you will, once the CCP took power. Obviously, in 49, when they were consolidating power, but this one, the CCP is in control of the PRC, and this is one of those purges where they start rounding up dissent, and they find it, and they start the anti-rightist movement, and then that launches the Great Leap Forward shortly thereafter.
No, the only thought that popped in my head was, it's just funny that Mao was like, all the smart people in my country don't like my ideas. How do I get rid of them?
I don't need
it's like, no, brother, that should tell you something, man.
Well, so it did. And then in 1957, there was, we just mentioned the first 5 years, there was this these collective farms. But in 57, there was a trial where they had one commune set up in the Henan province of, I think it was like 5,000 families-ish. And they had established a system where there was absolutely no private land ownership. There was communal farms, there was communal canteens, basically, and kitchens. So the idea was you didn't have to worry about where your meal was going to come from. You didn't have to cook. So everyone could go out and they could work in the fields, or as we'll see, in the iron smelters. This was put in place across the country, and there was about 25,000 of these different communes set up, each with about 5,000 families that had formed these communes around the country. And Mao gave a speech where he outlined that we will surpass the UK, who at the time was still considered an industrial powerhouse. And traditionally that's where the Industrial Revolution started. So we'll pass the UK in 15 years. And I kind of already mentioned this, but he also wanted to pass the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union and Khrushchev had laid out a plan where they were going to produce more than Western Europe and the United States. They were going to catch up to them in a lot of their, in a few specific commodities. So Mao wanted to do it too, but he also wanted to pass. I think that's the key. He wanted to pass the Soviet Union because there was this split between him and Khrushchev. And this is how he's going to do it. But if we go back to the Maoist and Leninist differentiators, that's partly because they had different population groups. So Mao had to figure out a way to industrialize a rural agrarian society rapidly. And how did he do it with these communes? Well, he just decided to set up iron smelters in the backyards of all of these communal farms, because they simply did not have the technical infrastructure in place to just go through and start building all these industrial machines. They didn't have heavy machinery to help them with farming. They didn't have heavy machinery to help them build. They didn't have the blast furnaces in place. And what little they had probably in Manchuria from the Japanese was destroyed. They were also losing the technical expertise of a lot of Russians. So as Khrushchev and Mao, their rift begins to grow, the Soviets began withdrawing more and more technical support, more and more funding, which also hurt the Chinese. So within agriculture, we had these communal farms. Within industry, we had communal smelters in the backyards. And these smelters, I'm not an expert on heavy metals and industry, but you have to get you have to get the furnaces hot enough to melt this iron down, to remove all of the impurities. And one of the problems with setting up an iron smelter in your backyard is that you need something to burn in order to get it hot enough that it can actually remove these impurities. And the Chinese weren't able to do it. So you had a bunch of peasants that had no idea what they were doing, going back and melting down pans and pots and pans and just old farm goods around to try and make this iron to meet their quotas. Well, it didn't get hot enough. So the product was what was called pig iron, which is basically this brittle, impure iron that really had not a lot of value because it couldn't be used on heavy machinery. It wasn't strong enough. It didn't have the properties of high quality iron. So it was basically they had fundamentally reorchestrated their economy around these production of iron and industrialization, and the product they were producing was terrible. What's interesting, you look at this, the Chinese, the CCP established these quotas on grain output and iron, and these quotas had to be met. And then you were rewarded based on exceeding your quota. If you're working sales, it's pretty much the same thing. But people were terrified of not meeting the quota. And these quotas that were established were highly, highly questionable based on where they got their numbers from and what they could actually reasonably produce. So within the first couple of years of the Great Leap Forward, you had corrupt bureaucratic officials coming around in these cadres who were reporting quotas that were incorrect. Or what they would do, they would take any excess that these farmers had produced, and then they would say that was actually a surplus. So anything that people needed to survive was being rated and thrown in as a surplus. So these bureaucrats, this cadre, would be rewarded by Mao during the time. And then anyone who questioned this, resisted, or was not producing was oftentimes beaten, was tortured, was potentially killed. There's one report of a Chinese bureaucrat coming in. I think the son had stolen potato and he had started eating, and they forced the father in front of the whole village to bury his son alive. And then the father died. So like, that's the kind of tactic and fear that they put in these villagers, was like, don't you resist. You better meet your quota and you better not steal. It doesn't matter if you're starving to death. And then you had people literally starving to death while grain rotted in silos, because that was the quote surplus that existed, that was for the state, which I think Mao had set it at 30% was needed to go to the state. So it was just these terrible, terrible conditions that these people had to exist in. And Mao was only getting reports of these surpluses, these quotas being exceeded. And it's crazy to think that nobody around Mao thought to say, they did later, but for a while, no one thought, well, Mao, we're not actually meeting a quota. People are starving to death. He did know a little bit about people in some areas, but the data he was being given was largely falsified. Couple that with the fact that there was some already environmental factors that contributed to a famine, on top of the fact that they were using really faulty agricultural practices. So like we said, that they were relying on a lot of the Soviet technical expertise. Well, in agriculture, there was a Soviet advisor who was giving them agricultural practices at the time before he was recalled to the Soviet Union. And he was talking about deep seeding. So they would seed the seeds too deep below the ground for them to grow. They were sowing them too close together. They were putting chemicals on there that was actually hurting their crop yield. They thought it was going to help. So coupled the fact that they didn't know how to farm correctly, they couldn't produce enough to meet the government quotas. People were living in terror because they had to meet the quota. So that food had to come from somewhere that they did produce. You had bureaucrats enforcing the system, also lying about it and feeding that up to Mao. It just created this massive famine. And I think it was the second largest famine in history, as far as the death toll goes. There's estimates for anywhere from 15 to 50 million people had died during this time. It's really hard for anyone to actually get an accurate estimate of how many people died, simply because the CCP covered up a lot of the deaths and they didn't report them. I think in the Culture War, they claim that even of that death toll, like 2.5 million people were beaten or murdered by the government on top of the ones that were starving to death. So it's really hard to get an accurate picture, but you can look. When I was doing research for this, you can see the birth rate versus the death rate. And for the first time in many years, you see that the death rate was actually higher than the birth rate, and the population of China went down dramatically. And I think, in 1958, their GDP rose by like 8%, but then by 1960, it had fallen by 30%. And I think that's the point when Mao looked at this and said, this is an abject failure. We're not producing quality iron. We're not actually industrializing. People are starving to death. I'm starting to hear the actual truth behind what's going on. So at this point, they decide to have what's called the 7,000 Cadres Conference.
Yeah. So a thought on the famine here. So, because I do think this is relevant to U.S. and Chinese relations, right? Like part of U.S. and Chinese relations is, looking at, like, comparing and contrasting one another's societies, politics, form of government, belief system, etc. because that's fundamentally how we interact with one another. And, the Cold War was largely built off of this belief here in the United States that the Soviet Union was an evil empire, right? And that's been criticized elsewhere. But the thought is like, no, it's not just like pure great power competition. There is this moral aspect of like we relate to other countries based on our view of their moral goodness or lack thereof, right? And the famine that took place, that's also called the Great Chinese Famine during the Great Leap Forward, is worth thinking about because, Colin, I had not heard that story that you were saying about a father being forced to bury his son alive. But I just want our listeners to pause for a second and think, like, one, is that even fathomable in Western society? I know here in the United States, like, we've got our own problems and there's some pretty messed up things that happen, but I have never heard of something that horrific happening here in the United States. I can't even imagine a situation in the entirety of the history of the United States where a government official forces a father to murder his own son in such a cruel and unusual way. Like, yeah, we've got problems, but not that one. and that's worth thinking about because, when we reflect upon our own issues here in Western society and in particular the United States, like we should take our own problems seriously, but we should thank God that that's not one of our problems, that I don't have to live in fear as a father, that I would have to murder one of my own children because one of my children did something
They stole a potato because they were hungry. Yeah, they stole a
potato. Like, that's crazy. So a theme, if I can introduce a theme, if we haven't already talked too much about it already, and that is the CCP is evil, was and is evil. I think it's important to have some kind of nuance in our conversations because I've said comments in the past about that might have been interpreted as sympathetic to CCP causes. For example, the Taiwan stuff. Like, yeah, Taiwan is a part of China. That is a geopolitical territorial statement that's just rooted in historical fact. Like, Taiwan, aside from a brief period where it belonged to Japan, and Japan took it from China, Imperial China, Taiwan belonged to China. That in no way means that I think, oh, the CCP isn't all that bad. Like, no, the CCP sucks. And the Great Leap Forward is just not the first, but one of the big examples of why what the CCP was doing is horrific. One last note on the Great Chinese Famine. If you guys decide, if our listeners decide to do research on your own, which you 100% should do, you'll see, was it between 15 and 55 million lives were lost, and that makes it either the worst or the second worst. If you just take the middle number, for simplicity's sake, that 30 some odd million people died, it's the worst famine. Like, I think the second worst famine is actually also occurred in China in somewhere in like 1907, maybe, and like 20 million Chinese died. The next several worst famines are in the tens of millions. Several of them were in India. The next one that's not in China or India was in the Soviet Union, where Holodomor, where the Soviet Union starved several million Ukrainians. It's like in the top 5 or 6 worst famines in recorded history. So this is no light thing. Like, we look back here in the United States, it is commonplace for people to talk about Hitler as the most evil person that ever lived. And if you were to actually pin people down, like, okay, why do you say that Hitler is the most evil person that ever lived? The go-to answer is the Holocaust. And yes, Hitler was a very evil person, and the Holocaust was awful. 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. I don't recall the other numbers, but there were quite a few others. Gypsies comes to mind, elderly, the physically debilitated, not necessarily a race, but like a category of individuals that the Nazi regime was intentionally just trying to kill off later. But Jews were the big one. That number is like, if you take the 30 some odd million that died during the Chinese famine, that's like 30%. Like Hitler killed 30%. If you're just comparing the Holocaust, not talking about total deaths of World War II here, and 30% of the number of people that Mao and the CCP killed just this once. We haven't even got to the Cultural Revolution. We haven't even got to later, after Mao, the Tiananmen Square massacre, where they literally were running people over with tanks. Anyway, just to wrap this rant up, when it comes to the Great Leap Forward, we have only begun to talk about the tragedy in the tragedy of what the CCP has done to the Chinese people, and just woefully evil nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And to think like, oh, that was in the past, let's let bygones be bygones. Like, would we have ever let Hitler remain in power? Like, is there a possible world in which we would have been like, you know what? It's okay. There are people today clamoring to remove Vladimir Putin. Germany has initiated the process to begin formal trials against Vladimir Putin for being a war criminal. There's not even 100,000 people dead in Ukraine. I don't say that to diminish what's going on in Ukraine right now, because yes, Vladimir Putin should absolutely be brought up on war crimes stuff, because there's tens of thousands of innocent Ukrainians that are dead, and that shouldn't be glossed over. But we're talking about in the tens of millions that are dead, directly responsible by the CCP and their stupid policies. Like, how is there any possible world that could have existed where they would remain in power? I don't think so. And yet here we are, not just accepting, but billions of US dollars go to the CCP. Companies are performing the kowtow. I don't want to get too political here, so I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole. But the point being is that we are absolutely in bed, in business with the CCP. And I think we all need to wake up to the fact that the CCP is not this like, oh, they're just socialists, like they're evil.
Yeah, they're not benevolent. Two quick thoughts on that real quick, since you brought up Putin and Stalin. So Stalin had a quote, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic. You read numbers like 50 million people died and millions were starved to death, and you just think, oh, that's a lot. That's as big as California. But you don't really realize the human cost of that. And there's some truth to what he said. People just kind of gloss over those numbers. But then you look at it today, and I didn't realize that, just doing some kind of secondary research on this, and looking through some recent news articles over the past few years, Joseph Stalin's popularity is at almost its highest peak since he was in power in Russia. And as a matter of fact, Vladimir Putin has even given, he's kind of invoked Stalin as this kind of authority figure in this, hey, he did a lot of things well. And a lot of Russians look at Stalin in a favorable light 70 years after the fact. So I don't know where I was going with that. I just wanted to point those two things out.
They depend upon our ignorance. And I think that's another reason why the Loins of History podcast is so important, and just history in general. Like, not to do a shameless plug for the podcast, but just to talk about, like, history is important, and true history is important. And when we whitewash our own history, when we don't look those ugly details straight in the face, we are in danger of doing it all over again, and people die.
That's very true. That's why we do it, to connect the past to the present. So bringing it back to the Great Leap Forward, that Jay, that was actually a very good monologue, though. But
Sorry.
it was a very good monologue, very powerful. The Great Leap Forward ended really with the 7,000 cadres conference. This is where Mao had a conference. Obviously, all of the CCP had gathered together, and in a lot of ways, it was kind of this airing of grievance, because at this point, it was you could not deny the fact that the Great Leap Forward was a failure. Some more moderates like Zhao and Lai, Liu Shaoqai, they were able to confront Mao more or less. And this 7,000 cadres was a point where they could come and talk about the failures of the Great Leap. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is how it played out. Because if you remember, there's a meeting in, I think it was the Conference of Victors. It happened in 1934 with Joseph Stalin, where they had 2,000 communist members come together, and there was kind of a lot of dissent because it was after the 5-year plans, and there was some dissent and question on his ability to lead. And it was just whispers. And that eventually led to the Great Purge, where Stalin, of the 2,000 members of the Soviet Russian communists, were killed within 3 years. Like half of them all died. He had half of them killed. So he knew what was going on, because he recognized, and Mao looked back at this and recognized that if I get all of these cadre together, there's going to be some question. I need to be very careful about how I play this. So within the 7,000 cadres conference, there was some dissent. I think the mayor of Beijing had collected like a dossier on the Great Leap and everyone who, all the failings, and he had collected it. And there was some members of the CCP that wanted it presented to essentially delegitimize Mao and remove him from power. Now, that didn't actually happen because Mao was evil, but he was no dummy. At this point, he was pretty politically savvy, and he had a few allies. And one of those allies was, by the way, that meeting in the Soviets, it was the Congress of Victors in the Great Hall in the Kremlin in 1934. So I had to confirm that. I couldn't remember it quite off the top of my head because I didn't anticipate talking about it today. But a guy by the name of Lin Biao, and he was a strategist during the Civil War, and he was kind of an odd, eccentric guy. He was like a germaphobe. He could barely drink water. He had to like be fed a sponge and food that was like soaked in water by his wife, because he was just kind of like an odd guy that lived in like solitary confinement, basically. But he was really widely respected because during the Chinese Civil War, he was one of the main strategists. And he gets up and he kind of starts backing Mao, but he backs him in a way that admitted mistakes but did not admit fault. And here's what I mean by that. They started, and a lot of Mao's allies started getting up and saying, yes, the Great Leap Forward was bad. We made mistakes. It didn't achieve its goals. But it wasn't because we were doing the wrong thing. We were doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. We wanted to industrialize. We wanted to change the country. And so Mao's allies, it started with Lin Biao, and it started moving through a lot of other cadre, and they started saying the same thing. And then Mao gets up and he does the same exact thing. He admits that it was wrong. He in a way, he kind of placates some of the dissenters and says, well, okay, we're going to stop this. We're going to stop this policy of the Great Leap Forward. We're going to figure out how we can fix this at this point. But I did it because I wanted the country in a better place. We needed to industrialize. We needed to do this as a party. So the dissent was basically not crushed, because it wasn't like forcefully at the point of a gun, or they weren't murdered. It was very simple that they were kind of placated and realized that they weren't going to have enough support to overthrow Mao, that Mao had come in and basically admitted that he was wrong, admitted that the Great Leap Forward was wrong, but they were still in the right. And it's almost like he still was like, hey, I still have the mandate of heaven. I'm still the leader. And everyone kind of got in line and was like, well, okay, I guess he's still going to be the leader of the CCP. We're going to make a few concessions here and there, political concessions. But as it turns out, 1 year later, and then in 1966, when they launched the Cultural Revolution, that he's just going to go through and purge everybody. But it was probably the low point of Mao's political power within the party. And it's just important to note that how he was able to play that.
That's a good point. It's kind of funny to look back on, the Cultural Revolution began with a response to the Soviet Union questioning Stalin and the cult of personality, and Mao and the CCP looking at that and going, nah, we gotta double down on the cult of personality. And then the Cultural Revolution ends with like, maybe this isn't such a good idea, but we're still not willing to change who our leadership is. So it's just strange how the lessons, like the right answer, seem so obvious to us in hindsight.
Well, a lot of the people in that conference were like, well, yeah, it was bad, but you know what? Maybe I could have done something different. They drew attention away from Mao in a lot of ways. Like, it wasn't like they blamed him. It was his cult of personality was so strong. They're like, well, Mao, I'm sorry I lied to you. I set you up for failure. I shouldn't have fudged these numbers on the quotas. I did this because I love the party and I wanted to do the best for the Chinese. So it was this very weird saying, I'm sorry.
It's very Chinese.
It is. It's like this, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. I'm sorry for doing what I did only because the result did not turn out the way we wanted it to be. Not because I think it was necessarily, a bad strategy, or I don't want to implicate you or something like that. I don't know. It's just very weird. They all, like, one after the other. This was wrong. We messed up. It was bad. I'm sorry. I could have done better, Mao. I could have done better. Yeah. I set you up for failure. So let's all come together. And then everybody sitting there listening to it was like, well, okay, I guess we're not overthrowing Mao. He survived.
I wish we had more time because I got a couple examples in my mind.
Go ahead and give one. Go ahead and give us one.
I'll pick one, the kowtow, right? Like the kowtow is just, I don't want to extrapolate too much from one thing. Like we can read into things that aren't there, but the kowtow, like you don't approach the emperor without like submitting yourself to a complete posture of unworthiness, right? And like even now, like when it's blatantly obvious the emperor made a mistake, you still perform the kowtow. Like it's just a uniquely Chinese thing to, when it's blatantly obvious the emperor is the one that's jacking things up, to somehow blame yourself.
The emperor doesn't have any clothes on, but nobody wants to tell him.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a good stopping point, because the 7,000 cadres conference is kind of this moment that, history, we like to look at these great moments as like, okay, this one moment led into this other big event. This is like a very good stopping point because it's going to lead into the Cultural Revolution. So to kind of summarize what we talked about today and just looking forward, we got to remember the Soviets and the Chinese now have started this split, and this rift is growing between Khrushchev and Mao, and then future Soviet leadership as well. They've split. They are not really going to get any closer at this point. The Chinese have begun this leap forward. They've stopped it. Millions have died, but they still want to industrialize, and that's still the ultimate goal. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we get to the next few episodes, because they're going to change the way that they try and industrialize and become a power. And then if you remember from some of the previous episodes on like the Taiwan Strait, they are trying to become this military power as well. And it's sort of this multipolar society now where you've got not just the U.S. versus the Soviets, it's now the U.S. versus the Soviets versus the Chinese versus the U.S. So it's kind of this, everybody's got a gun up in this Mexican standoff where everybody's kind of got guns pointed at each other, and things are not good. We always think it's this, so U.S. Soviets, it's not. It's a multipolar society, and that's going to dictate a lot of U.S. policy in Asia moving forward. So I think that's a good point to leave off. Next week, we're going to get into the Cultural Revolution and what that meant to the U.S. and Chinese relations. By the way, to the listeners, if a good book that I would recommend is The Cultural Revolution by Frank Decoder. That's where, the story of the father having to bury his son, like one guy getting his ears chopped off and then bound and shot. All those, it has a little bit where he talks about that in the opening chapters before he gets in the Cultural Revolution. So good book recommendation. Just want to shamelessly put that one in there. Yeah, no, Frank Decoder's is good. He's also a fellow at the Hoover Institution, one of my favorite think tanks. Yeah, so we really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a 5-star review and a comment. That really helps us out, get the word out there, that tells the algorithm that we're here and that you guys like it. We're also on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can find us all variations of the Loins of History, or you can see the links here in the show notes.
And also, if you do leave a review, 5-star review, we'll give you a shout out. We did get one 4-star review here recently, but if you leave a 5-star review, we'll give you a shout out here on the podcast. And we really appreciate you guys listening. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next week on The Loins of History.